clear from our previous lectures that the consequences of brain damage tell us a lot about the normal functioning of the brain. Sadly, this is especially true of Alzheimer's disease, a devastating disorder that has given us insight into the functioning of even the highest areas of the human brain. Alzheimer's disease is the #1 neurological disease in the United States, and its impact is absolutely devastating on many levels. Financially, for families, for the culture at large, and that doesn't begin to compare to the devastating emotional consequences of this disease for the individual who has it and also for the caregivers. Alzheimer's disease is named for the individual who first described it, Alois Alzheimer. He reported the case in 1907 of a 51-year-old woman, Auguste D., who had dementia. So dementia is a progressive mental deterioration. And it's really important for you to understand that Alzheimer's is only one type of dementia. So there are many different types of dementia. This is just one type. Auguste D., at autopsy, demonstrated some abnormalities in the brain that have become associated with this disorder. But more importantly, this was a 51-year-old woman who had massive inability to speak language. She couldn't relate to people. She couldn't remember who she was. There's a very famous report that she was asked at one point what her name was. And she wrote Mrs. and then stopped and was unable to complete the sentence and actually looked up at Alzheimer and said, "I have lost myself." And that has come to be the thing that most characterizes this terrible disorder. Now, the Alzheimer's disease is generally classified into two really broad categories. And it's really one disease, but we separate it out mostly so that we can do some research. And there are some differences between the forms, but not significant differences. Basically, we separate the disease into an early onset, which Auguste D. would be, an individual who develops it before the age of 65. There's also a late form of the disease, which occurs in individuals over the age of 65. So again, that distinction is not particularly important unless you delve into the scientific literature. Unless otherwise stated here in our course, I'll just use the term Alzheimer's disease to refer to the disease in general, because the same areas of the brain, the same changes that take place in both. It just depends on what age that the disorder comes on. The other thing which is really important for everyone to understand about this terrible disease is that there are genetic forms, so there are familial transmittable forms of this disease, but they account for a tiny fraction of the number of people who actually get it. So there are about 5 different forms that have been identified where there are gene mutations at specific sites. And even though that's true, all of those genetic forms together only account for less than 10% of all the cases. For all of the other cases of Alzheimer's, we have no idea what is causing it. And so we say that it is idiopathic, meaning cause unknown. One of the things that's been difficult in this area as well is that the disorder is actually fairly difficult to diagnose. Now, we're getting better at this. So we have a number of behavioral tests that you give individuals. There are different kinds of scans that can be used that help or support a certain diagnosis of Alzheimer's. But actually, because there's so many different types of dementia, Alzheimer's as a specific disease cannot be positively diagnosed until autopsy. So generally it's at autopsy when the brains are examined to look at the particular changes that take place in them. This is when the positive diagnosis is made. So what are the changes that take place in the brain? What are the changes that take place in this disease that robbed Auguste D. of herself? Well, there's a number of widespread changes in the brain, and one of the most obvious is going to be significant neuron loss. So neurons die in this disorder. and there's a significant loss of neurons throughout the brain. So throughout the brain you see loss. But what is interesting in this disease is that it's most pronounced in only a few areas. And we really believe that most of the signs and symptoms occur because of the loss of neurons in these few areas. So as I discuss these areas, one of the things I would like all of you as students in this class to do, we have actually talked about every one of these areas in the class except one. So as I'm reviewing the areas that are involved in this disorder, I want you to think about what signs and symptoms would be seen in a patient who loses these neurons. This is we're going to use this as a way to review everything we've covered up to this point in the class. So I'm going to start by going down this list. These are the main areas that you see changes in Alzheimer's: neocortex, entorhinal cortex and hippocampus, amygdala, nucleus basalis of Meinert, nucleus locus ceruleus, and raphe nuclei. So let's start with our neocortex. Neuron loss in the neocortex is massive. Now you remember that I told you that most of the cortex in the human brain is neocortex, that six-layered, most recently evolved cortex. Well, it turns out in Alzheimer's disease, it's this higher order neocortex that specifically degenerates. The loss of neurons is greatest in the highest order association areas. So the areas where the highest order cognitive processes take place. Now, it also means that primary areas remain intact. So, for example, the person can still see, they can still hear, they just can't think anymore. So the primary areas remain intact, but the highest order association areas are the areas which are lost in the neocortex. This loss of neurons is massive, and it leads to what we call cortical atrophy. Because this is the outer covering of the brain, you can actually see it at autopsy on gross examination of the brain. So this image shows you the image of an individual who has Alzheimer's disease on this side compared with a normal brain from an individual of the same age who did not have Alzheimer's disease. And you can see that the loss of neurons in this outer mantle, in these highest order association areas, can even be seen just by examining the brain from the outside. Other areas which specifically degenerate: the entorhinal cortex, which you may remember, I hope you remember, is a neocortical area, and the hippocampus, which is actually an old cortical area, both of which are involved in learning and memory, and in particular, short-term memory. And these are targets of this disorder. We actually believe that the entorhinal cortex is one of the very first areas to show abnormalities that are associated with this disease. One of the first areas, so memory loss will be one of the first things that is seen as the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus degenerate. The next area on our list was the amygdala. And if you remember, the amygdala is a deep nuclear complex that's located underneath the cortex in the temporal pole. And the amygdala plays a role in the processing of information that has emotional content to it. And so this nucleus starts to degenerate, so the person's ability to appreciate the emotional significance of something in a normal way is lost. The next nucleus is one we haven't covered in the class, and that's the nucleus basalis of Meinert. And the nucleus basalis of Meinert is a tiny little nucleus which is in the rostralmost extension of the reticular formation. So it's a reticular formation nucleus. You remember they extend all the way from medulla up into the telencephalon. Well, this is going to be a tiny, tiny little nucleus. In fact, that area of the brain was seen as being so insignificant that early neuroanatomists called that area of the brain the substantia innominata, the unnamed substance, because it wasn't seen as being important. Well, it turns out that this tiny little nucleus, given his own name, minor, to this nucleus, turns out to be very important. This little tiny nucleus utilizes acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter and has widespread diffuse projections to the cortex without relaying through the thalamus. So remember that most things that want to go to the cortex go through the thalamus. This is an exception to that. We don't know what the function of this tiny little nucleus is, but we do know something. In every single case where this nucleus degenerates, dementia occurs. So we know that whatever function this nucleus has is a very critical one for normal functioning of the brain. The next nucleus that shows a disproportionate loss of neurons is the nucleus locus ceruleus. And this is our little blue nucleus. And this is a tiny nucleus in the reticular formation of the pons. So the locus ceruleus utilizes one of the catecholamines, norepinephrine, as a neurotransmitter. And interestingly enough, it is also one of the nuclei that doesn't follow the general plan that if you want to go to cortex, you have to go through the thalamus first. The nucleus locus ceruleus has massive widespread projections to the neocortex. This is noradrenergic projection to the cortex with no relay in the thalamus again. The functions of this tiny little nucleus are many, and we've mentioned a few of them before. The locus ceruleus plays a role in the regulation of blood flow in the brain. That's pretty critical. In the extraction of oxygen and glucose in the brain, another very important function. In selective attention, or the ability to focus on something. The ability to focus is regulated critically by this tiny little nucleus. And last of all, plays a major role in sleep-wake cycles. So I want you to think about this tiny nucleus degenerating and what the consequences would be for any individual who had this neuron loss in this area. The next group of nuclei that show a disproportionate amount of loss are nuclei we have talked about before, and those are the Raphe nuclei. So again, Raphe nuclei are part of the reticular formation again, little tiny group of cells from medulla up into midbrain that use serotonin as a neurotransmitter. You will remember that this was the cell group which is the target of antidepressants, the serotonergic projections in the brain. Well, it turns out these Raphe nuclei also have massive projections to the cortex without a relay in the thalamus. So our reticular formation nuclei that are involved in this terrible disease are unusual in that they have these unique projections to the neocortex without going through the thalamus first. The Raphe nuclei, we know from many different lines of evidence, play a role in the regulation of mood. Now, all of these areas that I've mentioned show us substantial neuron loss. Estimates are that thousands of neurons a day are lost in this terrible disease. The neurons which remain in these areas and in other areas of the brain show abnormalities if you look on a pathological level. So these abnormalities that are characteristic of Alzheimer's, and this is how it's diagnosed at autopsy, is by looking for these abnormal inclusions. And they would look specifically in an area like the prefrontal cortex, higher order association area. That's one of the main areas involved. So a physician or a pathologist would look for these abnormalities in an area like that because they're disproportionately affected in the disease. So the first are neurofibrillary tangles, and these are just depositions within neurons of an abnormal filament. It's actually a normal filament that undergoes some kind of change in this disease and precipitates out. And if you use certain stains like silver stains, you can actually see them. The other abnormality associated with this disease are the plaques. And plaques are rather interesting in that they're in the extracellular space. So they're not in neurons, they're outside of neurons. They're something that comes to be formed in that extracellular space that shouldn't be there. So the main part of this is a central area where there's a deposition of a particular protein called amyloid. And amyloid is a normal beta amyloid is a normal protein found in the brain, but in Alzheimer's it becomes deposited in increasing amounts that are not taken away from the brain as would be the normal process. So you get this abnormal deposition of amyloid, and what happens is around it, glial cells are recruited to try to get rid of it, and the dendrites and axons that might be in the area also become abnormal. So you get this huge thing called a plaque deposited in the extracellular space. This is an image that shows you the neurofibrillary tangles. These are neurons that have so many tangles, these abnormal filaments in them, that they look almost black. And you remember, this is not what normal neurons look like. Here's another one that has these abnormal filaments. This is a plaque. It's sitting out in the extracellular space, and this is a highly abnormal structure sitting out there, this beta amyloid protein and abnormal astrocytes and other types of glial cells surrounding it. Now, what other types of changes are taking place in the brain? Well, you have many other abnormalities. You have a loss of dendrite synapses. It doesn't take much to think about that. If you're losing neurons, you're losing dendrites, you're losing synapses massively. So it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of synapses a day are lost in Alzheimer's disease. This is a massive disorder affecting many areas of the brain and destroying the architecture that's responsible for normal neural transmission. You also have abnormalities in blood vessels in this disease. So that same amyloid that gets deposited in the brain that helps form those plaques, this amyloid gets deposited in the blood vessels in the brain and throughout the body. And this amyloid can actually damage the blood vessel wall and lead to a rupture of the blood vessel wall. And one of the most common reasons that individuals who have this disease die is from cerebral hemorrhage. And it's because the amyloid has come to completely replace the blood vessel walls in the brain. The last change you see, there are actually many other changes, but the last major change you see is in the blood-brain barrier. So the brain normally has a cellular barrier that keeps things out. And this is good because evolution wouldn't have gone to all this work to have a brain like we have, and then let chemicals from the outside world or something, abnormally affect it. So there's a cellular barrier that keeps things out, like metals, for example. Well, in Alzheimer's disease, this blood-brain barrier breaks down, and when pathologists cut up the brain and look at it, one of the earliest discoveries was, for example, that individuals who have Alzheimer's have 30 times the accumulation of things like aluminum in their brain. And so this continues a process of cell death because you now have things in the brain that shouldn't be there. It's obvious that the word devastating hardly describes this terrible disease. The areas that are involved are among the most important in the human brain for the characteristics that are associated with our species. So this is really, really devastating on many, many different levels. The behavioral changes that you see in individuals are generally classified into early, middle, and late stages. Now, not every person who gets this disease will have every single one of these stages. Not every single person will have every sign and symptom. But what I've tried to do is list for you the most common changes that you see in people. So these are most common. Early in the disease, there's a slight memory loss. So you have people having trouble, particularly with short-term memory. You also have a decreased initiative. And this is one of the things we've come to realize is a real part of this disease. Individuals lose interest in hobbies they've had for their entire lives. They also show changes in personal hygiene. They're not interested in taking a shower every day. They're starting already in the early stages to lose their attachment to life in some meaningful way and to others. As a little bit at the same time, still within these early changes, individuals can show a massive depression. Now, we used to think that we didn't think that it was actually depression. What we thought was maybe this is just part of a syndrome that's involved, and it looks like depression to us. And the reason we didn't think it was depression was because if you gave tricyclic antidepressants, people got worse. So we thought, well, maybe it's not really depression. Well, it turns out that the tricyclics have a side effect of decreasing cholinergic projections in the brain. So it was making one of these areas that was already degenerating not even be able to function as well as it could function. So we now believe that depression is a real part of this disorder caused by degeneration of those Raphe nuclei. Prozac, or one of the SSRIs, are generally given to help people with this and work very, very effectively. Lastly, in this early stage, you often see faulty judgment. And when you ask individuals to think back about their loved one, to think back about early changes or changes they saw a couple of years ago, they'll often say there were times when my husband or my wife was making decisions that I thought were really bad, but they didn't seem to notice it, and I didn't say anything at the time. They were under stress, or I just thought it was just a bad decision, whatever. But faulty judgment, in fact, is part of the disease. As the disease progresses to the middle stage, you get increased memory loss, massive memory loss, and changes in the person's ability to process information. You get subtle changes in higher order functions. For example, individuals can no longer get the point of jokes. This is a higher order function, particularly good jokes that are sort of a turn on a word or something subtle. And so an individual looks at a cartoon and they just don't get it. And that's because the brain isn't able to process it. Another thing that often happens at this stage in the disease are mood disturbances. So they can show a variation by the time of day. So you have individuals that often do something called sundowning. And that means they become very agitated and irritable and extremely anxious in the evening. So as the evening comes on, the caregiver who's worn out at this point isn't going to get any sleep because now the Alzheimer's patient is very, very agitated. And actually, Alzheimer's patients can go 3, 4, 5 days with no sleep at all in one of these agitated states. So these mood disturbances are very common. In the late stages, you see severe memory loss, and now even long-term memory is gone. Even long-term memory is gone. Also, you see the individual loses their sense of self. And we believe that one of the reasons for this is because of the degeneration of that left hippocampus that takes episodic memory and strings it together in this autobiography that we call the story of our lives. And because the hippocampus is a main site of degeneration in this disease, it means that these individuals lose their autobiography. And I think one of the truly horrible things about this disease is that it robs the person of a sense of themselves because it robs them of the memories of their lives. And it's truly one of the most devastating things for families to see in someone that they love. There are other kinds of changes that usually occur late, psychiatric problems like paranoia. Language is a higher order function. You have individuals become mute. They can no longer understand language. They can't understand spoken language or written language. They can't read. They can't understand what you're saying to them because those higher order areas are specifically the ones that are affected in the disease. You also see other kinds of sort of psychiatric problems. Hypersexuality is one that's very difficult for caregivers to deal with. The individual may go through a phase where they just constantly want sex. It's not closeness they want, it's purely sex, and they can behave very crudely, and they'll go through this phase for maybe 3 months. And it's very difficult for the caregivers because they realize that they're no longer making love to someone they love. This individual is not there anymore, but they're behaving in this way. And then as soon as it starts, it stops just the same way. And then the next day, they're off to some other kind of fixation. Maybe it's eating. So you can have individuals that go into these stages where they eat everything. You have to put locks on the doors. You have to make sure they can't get in the refrigerator. They literally will eat and eat and eat. And these are problems that unless you've seen someone go through this or heard the stories of people who have gone through it, are hard to even imagine that a person can degenerate to this state. So, these kinds of changes that take place in the brain are characteristic of this disease, and they manifest themselves in these sorts of behavioral changes. We can only imagine the devastation this is for a family or for children in a family whose parent shows these changes. Individuals who have Alzheimer's disease and the caregivers need an enormous amount of support from all of us, from our society, from all of us as friends. Certainly the caregivers need a lot of support from physicians because they're the ones that are on the front lines trying to help individuals. Now, at the present time, there's no known cause. There's only a few cases that are genetically determined. So for most of the cases, there's no known cause, and for all cases, there is no cure. So at this point, the medications that are given really to help replace neurotransmitters that have been lost. So you see drugs like Aricept that are given to help replace acetylcholine. You see other drugs being given to Alzheimer's patients that increase levels of glutamate. Glutamate being used as one of the major neurotransmitters in all systems, so it's certainly one that's affected in this. So at this point, all we have are ways to try to help with the signs and symptoms. And most of these drugs work best early on, obviously, in the disorder. Now, for those of you who have someone who's been diagnosed with this terrible disease or are interested in reading more about it, I'd like to recommend two absolutely wonderful books. One is a book by John Bailey. It's called Elegy for Iris, and it's about the writer Iris Murdoch, who developed Alzheimer's disease. And her husband, John Bailey, chronicled her descent into being a non-person, basically. And he talks very poignantly about what it's like to see someone you love dearly show these changes and how hard it is on the caregiver. Very, very good book. The other book that I would highly recommend is by Thomas DiBaggio, and it's called Losing My Mind. He's been on public radio. He was a writer who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and what he has done, he chronicled his own descent and loss of his sense of self. From the beginning of the book to the end of the book, you can see the deterioration, his ability to use language as he struggles to describe what it's like to lose that your sense of attachment to the world and to yourself. And it's just a very, very good book. Now, lest I leave you, because this is very tragic stuff we've been talking about, lest I leave you that way, I want you to know that in the next lecture, we're going to talk about risk factors that are involved in this disease. We're going to talk about risk factors, things that can increase your risk of getting this disease, and things, some of which are under your control, that can help decrease the risk of getting Alzheimer's. So while we don't know what causes it, we know that there are certain risk factors associated with the disease, and that is what we're going to talk about next. Thank you.